Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to O Comely magazine, and in particular focusing in this video on representation. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying AQA A-level Media Studies. It's currently one of the set magazines on that specification. So if we have a look at the representation of women and femininity on the magazine, it's a medium shot of a woman's face on the front cover. She looks quite young, she's wearing makeup and earrings, and she's posed for the camera. And that is, I guess, particularly conventional for magazines. This idea that, perhaps this girl is being displayed for the camera. So there is some kind of objectification of her as a kind of model, but it is quite unconventional. Her hair is short and it's sort of up. It's quite hard to tell on the front cover. She's got a very natural looking face, so not kind of harsh makeup that you're often used to seeing on magazine front covers. Her clothes are not revealing, so this means that she's not sexualized in that way for the camera, and this is quite unconventional. They're not posing her body in a way that is designed to make an audience gaze at her like a heterosexual male. We're just almost designed to look at her face and see her as a person, so it's quite humanizing the picture rather than dehumanizing. The words used on the front cover, again, quite unconventional words linked to representations of women. So words such as power, hard won, and strong. So quite strong, powerful, dominant words to use in conjunction with a picture of a woman. So perhaps challenging conventional representations of women and femininity. They use words like wisdom, ideas, and mischief, and these words are quite active, often traditionally more associated with men rather than women in the media. Unconventionally for magazines, there is no focus on her appearance. So there's no cover lines talking about makeup or diets or clothes or fashion. And that is what you often expect to see on magazine front covers. So there's absolutely zero focus on appearance. So perhaps the magazine is trying to communicate that there's more to women than just their looks. Have a look at the actual masthead as well. The word comely, it's quite an old-fashioned word. It traditionally meant sort of attractive, but it's not a word that ever really meant sort of sexualized or, sexy. So it's a kind of old-fashioned word for pretty or attractive. And so again, it's a word that is associated with, thinking positive things about women, but not in a sexualized way. There's definitely a representation that women have a strong, powerful role in society and a powerful voice. They use phrases such as speaking out and strong voices, and they even use the phrase revolution. It really gives this idea that women have a lot of power. And this is quite unconventional. In more stereotypical representations of women in the media, women are often silenced and they're submissive, and they're represented as being passive and quiet. So this idea of women being vocal and dominant and speaking out and revolutionary is quite alternative. The strapline for the magazine is admire, follow, and inspire. So it's quite an interesting strapline. It really is talking about women being role models and inspiring other women to look up to them and to follow them. So it's a strapline that really tells you about how they want to represent women to their readers. If you have a look at some of the women mentioned in the magazine, Farmer is described as an unstoppable force, which makes her seem really strong and powerful. Diana is shown in a spotlight on a stage, which again makes her seem important and the centre of attention. Megan Jane Crabbe is plus size, which again is something not often represented within women's magazines. And it's about this idea of not conforming to mainstream ideologies about women's looks and appearances. So again, challenging typical representations of women. In fact, as you can see from these images of the women featured in the magazine set pages, the photos have been taken to almost deliberately not sexualise them. Their bodies are not the focus of these images. Most of the images are medium shots or medium close-ups. The women are fully clothed. Their clothes are reasonably casual. And so the idea is that they are being shown, the reality of these women's lives. They certainly, are wearing, beautiful clothes, some of them, but it's not there to be sexualized or objectified. It's almost like a kind of a realistic look at women's appearances. Amali is described as being the CEO of a tech company. Women often notoriously underrepresented within the technical industries and often seen as not being as technically capable as men. So having her being, labelled as somebody that not only works at one of these tech companies, but is CEO, again, very challenging representations of women in positions of high power and status. Within the magazine, there is basically an absence of men, and that's something important to look at as well. It represents perhaps men as being far less important than women, and again puts the focus on women as being very dominant and powerful. It perhaps reflects the magazine's status as a feminist magazine. Also reflective of the fact that the magazine considers itself to be alternative and niche and aimed at an alternative indie audience. Let's have a look at ethnicity within the magazine as well. There are some really positive, happy, smiling representations of refugees and asylum seekers. So people like Meltem, really kind of challenging the representation that we often see in the media, in other media products. Farmer Mohammed is Somali and he is pictured in a headscarf. Headscarves on women are often traditionally just not shown within mainstream media products. So showing her within a headscarf, it feels quite inclusive and quite diverse, perhaps representing the more diverse aspects of our culture now. It's also an incredibly positive representation as well. People from Somalia and other countries within that area are often represented in quite negative ways in the media, whereas she is represented as studying really hard. She's talking about being a campaigner, being politically active. She's smiling, lots of bright colours. It's very, very positive. And so it's perhaps challenging representations of ethnicity in those respects. The article talks about her fight against female genital mutilation, so clearly drawing attention to women's issues and the oppression of women within certain cultures. And this perhaps might be seen as a kind of feminist look at the struggle that women often have against patriarchal systems. Towards the end of the page about her, the magazine writes that she is a sister that we can all be proud of. And the word sister is capitalised. Perhaps this idea that kind of trying to represent women as a sisterhood, as a community, as a group that they all belong to, and drawing the audience into that as well so that they feel part of this female empowered community too. Again, going back to our tech CEO, often women of colour are represented, if you think about people like Bell Hooks, she often talks about women of colour being represented as even more discriminated against than white women. And so having this particular woman as being shown and talked about as being the CEO of a tech company perhaps challenges Bell Hooks' ideas, showing women of colour in positions of authority. The magazine does reflect some of Bell Hooks' ideas. It does talk about a hard-won wisdom. So this idea that women have had to fight for equality, women have had to fight for what they've achieved. So perhaps reflecting this idea of a feminist fight against the patriarchy. If we have a think about representations of age as well, young people often shown in quite a negative way in the media. People often represent teenagers and young adults as being lazy, as not, doing anything beneficial for society. Whereas actually in this magazine, you can see some quite positive representations. So Farmer is shown as being very hardworking, interested in politics, being very respected within her community. Deanna Roger is described as the youngest ever party champion and public speaker. So a very kind of confident young woman and doing something that's above and beyond what is typically expected of her age. Meltem is described as only being 13 when immigration officers broke in and sort of arrested people from her family. And so perhaps representing young people at that point as being quite vulnerable, which is a more typical representation, but it does create a lot of sympathy in our eyes, in the audience's eyes. It makes us recognise just how vulnerable some of these people are, whether it's in terms of their age, their gender or their ethnicity, or a combination of all of those aspects. So creating quite a sympathetic representation that it positions the audience to really like these women. Stuart Hall thinks that a lot of media products revolve around really simple stereotypes. And actually this magazine challenges that. There's quite complex representations of age and gender and ethnicity here that don't revolve around typical stereotypes. Judith Butler talks about gender performativity and gender roles often being constructed through performance. And actually we don't get those typical elements of performance in this magazine. We're not seeing people, brush their hair and do their makeup and wear high heels and cook and clean. We're reading about elements of more masculinity that we are often seen in the media. So things like public speaking, confidence, politics, that kind of thing, studying hard, intellectualism, being the manager of a company. Perhaps performances that we often associate more with masculinity, but represented in relation to women in this magazine. So again, potentially challenging Butler's theories as well. In the magazine, there are some inclusions of trans people and trans stories as well, and they are often completely neglected in magazines and other media products. So Ash and his transition is described in the magazine, and so the idea is that these representations of gender are quite diverse. They are not just binary representations. We are seeing a more pick and mix representation of identities, which might reflect Gauntlet's ideas. They even say within the article that he oscillates between the two binary codes. So the magazine itself is actually saying that gender is not a binary thing, and that actually, he kind of moves between these two more typical binary representations. So very much kind of representing Gauntlet's ideas of a more diverse range of identities that audiences can choose from. There have been some more inclusions of trans stories in the media more recently, especially as there have been some celebrities who have become openly trans in the media. However, they tend to be about people who kind of fully transition, whereas this article is a lot more about fluidity and Ash's decision to move between genders, both forwards and backwards. And so this perhaps is a little bit less conventional. It also represents quite a realistic look at women's and men's lives and their health. It's not glorifying anything. It's not making anything seem perfect or utopian. It talks about depression, mental health, real struggles with what it is to be either female or male. So gender identities being seen as something that's really quite complex and difficult to deal with. It really makes the siblings look very close, very nice, very friendly. They're posed together nicely in the frame, laughing, smiling. So you've got images within this article of Ash when he was female and Ash when he was male, plus both of the siblings when they were children. You've got quite mixed, therefore, representations of gender, and so not representing gender as being set in stone. One of the reasons why this article might show kind of such a positive representation of fluid gender identity is because it is written by the sister, Andrea. So you can see that in the byline here. It tells us that the words and photos are by her. And so therefore, it explains why it might be such a realistic but overall positive representation of this pair of people. So that was my easy to understand guide to Old Comely magazine and representation. Don't forget to check out my channel for other videos. There's more stuff coming on Old Comely magazine soon, as well as other set texts, keywords and theories. If there's a particular video that you would like that I don't already have, feel free to leave a little message below and I will see what I can do.